Well, talking about specific models, regulations, patterns, and an almost modern approach to the weapons distribution pipeline within the army becomes increasingly common from the Napoleonic times throughout the 19th century. When we're looking at earlier swords, so 18th century and earlier, it's not as easy. So we know very well that the first patterns on British swords, for example, date to 1786. And even then, these patterns were more indications, you could say, of kind of parameters within which you had to stay for the sword to be regulation. But the details were still often up to officers, which had to use the unit's coffers to provide for the swords for their unit, for instance. This is not the case for the sword we are talking about today. This is a model 1747 Prussian Dragoon sword. This is the follow-up or improvement, if you want, on an even earlier model, which was the 1734 Prussian Dragoon sword. And these swords, despite how early they are, especially the 1734 we're talking about, to be rolled out in 1734 means that obviously the planning and production would have had to happen years before, so we're almost in the first quarter of the 18th century. These swords were standardized, produced centrally in the facilities in Potsdam, and were distributed centrally, let's say, to the 6 Dragoon regiments of the Prussian kingdom. And they were paid for directly by the central, I suppose, kingdom or army budget. So in that sense, they are groundbreaking, at least in my experience. I haven't seen earlier versions of such modern approach, let's say, to the production pipeline. And this makes them really interesting beyond the sword itself, but in the context of, I suppose, military supply knowledge. But why come up with a new model in 1734 and why revise it in 1747? What were the specific needs, if any, for this modernization? Well, it turns out that there were some specific needs. So before 1734, Prussian dragoons used what, if I interpreted the translation I read correctly, what were essentially walloon-hilted swords. Not only that, but they used a short version of walloon-hilted swords. And this was because the sword was essentially a sidearm. The function of the dragoons was to disrupt enemy lines by, I suppose, charging at them, flanking them, and then moving back, and kind of cutting their way or piercing their way through enemies and breaking up the lines so that I assume cuirassiers or heavier cavalry could come in and then finish the chopping. So over time, as the Prussian army modernized, I suppose they felt the need for a standardized sword for the dragoons. And this sword came in a version that is relatively similar to what you see here. So while this isn't specifically a 1734, it's close enough that it gives an idea of what the sword would have been like. The main difference is that the blade would have had a hexagonal section, so basically 2 flat central sections with sloping ridges, so 6 sides, and would have been generally lighter. The hilt was also lighter, so it was a little bit smaller and a little bit lighter overall. But I don't have any examples of this sword with me, and that's not the center of today's topic. Today we talk about its evolution, which is the 1747. So why the need to switch up this sword and to give it what may feel like a small cosmetic overhaul, but a rather significant change in the blade, for example? Well, the need is a very practical one, and it's that cavalry combat was changing, and dragoon troops were increasingly fighting in a more similar way to that of cuirassiers. So their lighter sword was suddenly not appropriate anymore for the kind of combat that was expected of them. So this basically meant that the sword had to be redesigned to fit this new way of fighting for the dragoons. And this came in the form of a lenticular blade, which is rather long. We're over 90 centimeters in many cases. I think like 94 centimeters is the standard. Has a spear tip and is quite heavy, and this is also matched by a rather bulky brass hilt. Now, surprisingly, and if you've seen my unboxing video where I think I kind of motioned at the thrust and said I wouldn't want to be on the end of the tip of this sword, this is incorrect, because the expected use of this sword was actually the cut. So the expectation was that these dragoons would charge into the enemy lines, standing on their stirrups, and kind of deliver top-down blows, I suppose, basically cleaving people, and opening up the lines for then the cuirassiers to charge in. There's actually an interesting excerpt from a 1743 regulation, which I'll read to you. It's a Google Translate version of the German original, so I'm not sure it's exactly a philological translation, but it's good enough to see what was expected of these dragoons. And the reason why this regulation dates to 1743 is that at the time, they doubled the amount of dragoon regiments. So previously there had been 6, and I suppose they were enough for the time. But obviously, moving towards the second half of the 18th century, the need was felt for more dragoons. So troops from infantry were kind of promoted into cavalry, and thus they obviously needed training on the new weapon and on the techniques that they were expected to use. So here's the excerpt I was mentioning. The new people must also be shown how to draw their swords and have to take it back again. So this may seem a little ridiculous, because these people were already soldiers, they were infantry troops. You would expect them to be able to unsheath and sheath their sword back again in use. But when you feel this sword, and it's 1.5 kilos by over a meter, it's about 1.10 m or 1.7 m, I think, length. So it's a considerably long and heavy sword. And considering that these guys would have been using them on horseback and in a rather aggressive battlefield situation, it's not perhaps as ridiculous as it initially sounds that they needed to be trained to sheath and unsheath the sword. Like, already by moving the sword around, waving it around while sitting, I can feel my arm getting tired. So obviously training on the core movements was necessary. Anyway, this wasn't all that was expected from them. And it must be impressed upon them right from the start that the greatest advantage of the cavalry lies in cutting. So this is also really interesting, because you, as I mentioned earlier, you may think that a sword like this, it's kind of a palish style sword, and we tend to think that these are thrusting swords. You just kind of extend your arm and charge straight into the enemy. But no, at the time, at least in Prussia, or at least according to Prussian leaders, military leaders, the main technique, or the most effective technique, was the cut. And more than that, the cut had to be performed standing. In fact, the regulation continues. And when a dragoon rises in the saddle and executes the blow from above, it also has twice as much force as when cutting while sitting. Okay, this kind of makes sense. Of course, you can exert more, you can put more energy into the cut, but still, it's interesting to see it put on paper in a regulation. It continues. After that, the new men must be shown that they hold the sword in such a way that they cut with the edge and not with the flat. Again, this may seem ridiculous, because first of all, even a person who's never held a sword knows that this is not how you use it, but it's kind of this way. But again, we're talking about people that were already soldiers. These were infantrymen who had been promoted into the cavalry. So they would obviously know how to use a sword. And I think this is a sign of how difficult this sword is to correctly wield. Again, it's 1.5 kilos, and being able to, in the middle of battle, on a charging horse, to be able to line it up effectively to cut through an enemy without like the edge falling flat, is something that may seem obvious, but obviously who was designing the training and the regulations was well aware that it was a risk. In terms of its composition, we mentioned it's quite heavy, but when we talk about its balance, we can see that, let's say, if I put my finger in a not very scientific test of its balance point, it's fairly close to the hilt. And even though it's very close to the hilt, the blade is still quite heavy, because it doesn't really taper much. So it still has quite a bit of mass towards the tip. It's not a sword that lightens very well. So while it's really good at hacking, certainly, it's not the most manageable of swords. And I think we've seen this already in the regulation because of all these small caveats they have of why you need to train soldiers even in small things that seem obvious. And I think this is because it's a very unwieldy sword. It was not very well received as a sword, although it did have a rather long life. So these hilts were produced well into the end of the 18th century. So I think we even still have some examples being produced like in 1800. But it was not very well received. It was considered unwieldy, basically. The balance was considered to be off. So in the years between 1747 and basically it's phasing out around the end of the 18th century, you'll see a lot of small changes happening, big and small changes. There are changes in the blade, so effectively there's also basically a variant of this model, which is the 1747/97, because there are some changes applied in the blade. There are changes made to the hilt to kind of distribute weight better or differently, and there are obviously aesthetic changes as well. This makes it a really interesting model of sword because although it is one kind of sword, the subtle differences and not so subtle differences you can see within it can help date it rather precisely. On the other hand, there are also so many of these subtle and not subtle differences that it actually is not very easy to date at all, at least for me, having only held one of these in my hand and not having more experience than what I can gather from a book. Speaking of books, if this is a kind of time in history and a kind of sword or a kind of army that you are interested in, I cannot recommend this book more. This is absolutely a masterpiece of a book. The amount of information that it covers on swords produced in Potsdam is just off the charts. Probably almost more than any I've seen in almost any other book. And the author is Bernd A. Windsheimer. So yeah, so thank you for an amazing work he did. Pick up a copy if you can. It's in German, so that's why you may have to use Google Translate. So back to our sword. I hope I've covered the historical context for this sword enough. It could go in way more detail, but I think I've already stretched it more than the video warrants because we actually want to see the sword itself. So its main characteristics are in the hilt. You'll see there's a brass hilt. There are apparently 12 examples, extant examples of steel hilt versions of the sword. So it's really, 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 really rare. But other than that, they tend to be brass. You have a semi-basket hilt, which is not too far when you actually look at it from a walloon hilted hilt. In a sense, it's a beefier, heavier, more complex kind of hilt, but it does show where it evolved from, I think. You have this kind of X pattern between the two guards here. You have a eagle head pommel, and you have a thumb ring which protrudes over where on walloon hilted swords you would have instead a second plate. The blade changes considerably between the model 1834 and the 1847. So the 1874 tends to have, as I mentioned, a hexagonal blade, so a flat section at the center of each side and then two sloping sides, and is generally shorter, I would say. What you find moving into the 1847 is a lenticular section sword, so there is no central ridge, there is no like angular slopes to it, but you have basically a curved and pretty flat section to it. It cuts on both sides, so it's a double-edged sword. And yeah, and as I mentioned already, the dimensions, it's about 94 centimeters, only the blade. There are some expected markings to be found. These don't happen though on every sword, and it depends on a bunch of different historical criteria or moments, but you will often find a Potsdam writing, that is the mark of the producing facility, and then you will find a eagle in many cases, which is an acceptance mark. Moreover, you'll see a whole bunch of on some of them, you'll see regimental marks, initials that can mean a whole bunch of different things. So they're swords that in many cases have a lot of messages or symbols on them that can help determine them quite clearly. But I think I've talked long enough, and I think it's time to see it in detail. And here we are with our typical close-up angle. Again, apologies for me not being able at the moment to provide like a full shot of the entire length of the sword. I hope this will be coming as soon as I move to my new place. There's so much detailed information for all of the variants and everything for this model of sword that I thought it would actually not be that useful for me to kind of just parrot what's being said without necessarily having all of the examples and variants of this sword. And I'll just refer you to Windsheimer's book, because that is where you're going to find exactly what you need if you're interested in variants on this sword. What I'm going to do here is go through the main characteristics and show you points of variance without really going into what each different variant is. So the first thing we're going to see is this heavy brass hilt. As I mentioned, there are 12 extant iron hilts, but they're basically the same. But of course, if you find an iron one, you're really in luck, because you have one of just a little more than 2 handfuls of swords. However, even these brass versions are not that common. These weren't made in the millions as you would find briquettes, let's say, or other kinds of more mass-produced swords. So there were 6 regiments of dragoons in Prussia, and the original number of these was 720 per regiment. So if you make your calculation, it's basically 720 times 6. Which is somewhere, I suppose, in the 4,000-ish number, if I'm not completely off. And these were then doubled in 1743, as I mentioned. So there was a need for more dragoons, so that kind of number doubles to around maybe 8. Let's say overall it might have been 10,000 dragoons. Considering a few of these may have been lost and remade. There have been some redundant numbers ordered, but let's say it's unlikely that there would have been more than 10,000 of these made at the time. So if we consider that some of these were then probably repurposed, damaged and destroyed and lost at the time, it's not a very common sword to find. In any case, we will start by looking at the hilt here. The hilt is very striking, I find. It's massive, and it is reminiscent of a Walloon hilt, if you think about it. And in fact, the sword is, in a sense, an evolution of the Walloon hilt. Although, considering the German context we're talking about, we should probably refer to it as a Haudegen, so a hewing sword. What reminds me a lot of the Walloon hilt is this kind of basket hilt with these 2 branches. We have one knuckle guard and then one literally at a 90-degree angle, which covers the outside of the hand. And instead of what we would normally find on Walloon hilts, which would be this branch that kind of connects to the knuckle bow here, what we have is basically 2 ribbons of brass that cross and kind of provide an extra protection to the hand. In between these 2 ribbons is this piece of metal that kind of looks like a plate, but it's not a separate part of metal. It's cast together with the whole assembly here. If we look at the top of the hilt, again, we see something that is quite reminiscent of Haudegens. So we have these 2 side plates. They're not symmetrical. Actually, almost opposite, in an opposite form as Walloon-hilted swords. The outside one here is smaller, whereas the inner guard here is actually the wider one of the 2. And the wider one houses the thumb ring, which is also quite common on Walloon-hilted swords. The main differences here are the lack of piercing. So this is a 1 plate. And more interestingly, perhaps, the fact that the thumb ring protrudes out of what on a Haudegen would be covered by a plate. So it's by design lacking that second plate, and this instead is room for the thumb to fit. The thumb ring is massive, by the way. It definitely fits 2 thumbs for sure. So, coming to other characteristics of the hilt area, we have a rather stout grip. It's made of wood. The wood is then wrapped in twine, and you can actually see it here basically. Under what creates these little bumps under the leather is this twine wrapping. And then it's covered in a very delicate leather actually. And this leather is then bound in simple metal wire, so it's not like a twisted or braided wire. The last characteristic element of the sword, and maybe one of the most characteristic in general, is this eagle head pommel. So the eagle is basically facing towards the cutting edge of the blade. And yeah, you can see it has a beak, some angry eyes, and a bunch of different characteristics lined to kind of show its plumage. And then it has this button at the top, which is where the blade is pinned in place. Now, I'm mentioning all of these characteristics, not because they're necessarily all super interesting, but because each one of these is or can be a determining factor when you're trying to identify when between, let's say, 1734 and 1800 your specific sword or the sword you're looking at may come from. A few examples of what I can say is that the wire wrapping is initially the amount of wires on the wrapping here can help determine age. So the more there are, usually the earlier they are. I think you have like up to 23 or 25 wraps on early ones. And you have as low as, I think, 12 or 13 wraps on the later ones. This one happens to have 17, so it's kind of somewhere in the middle, I would say. Another distinguishing factor is that in much later versions of these, the wire was braided. So apparently this was following a trend of the time. So the French trend was to have like a braided metal wire or twirled. And so the Germans or the Prussians did the same. So when you see a simple wire, this is a sign of something slightly earlier. Other differences, and these are the ones I won't even get into because they're so complex, let's say in specific, but is the distance, if I'm not mistaken, of where these bars connect to the knuckle bar, the certain aspects like in the shape of this metal, aspects of the shape of the thumb ring. So whether it's more oval, more squashed on the side, more round, all of these are variants that are not by chance there, like they're not defects of production, but they show the different phases of iterations, we could say, of how the sword came to have its final form, let's say. Same thing goes for the quillin. There are different shapes. I've seen fewer that look like this one, so with a rather straight quillin. They usually tend to kind of have a slightly more elaborate finial. But again, it's hard to list how those differences affect the dating of a sword. Another interesting point is the grip here. As you'll see, this one here tends to have a bit of a bulge in the center. It's a symmetrical bulge, so it's not like only here where the hand grips, but it's even on the back. More recent versions of this sword tend to have a conical section, so I would assume that they go from thin here and simply widen up towards the top. And you also have big differences in how the eagle pommel looks. And these are both aesthetic, but also practical. The changes in the pommel or in the hilt were often to add weight to the back, to make it more back heavy, for example, or to make it more backlight if they were lightening it. But, you know, different distributions of weight would have an effect on the sword itself. As you'll see in this case, this eagle seems to have a seam through it, so it seems to be not cast in one piece, but out of two halves. This is usually a sign of a later pommel. And this button tends to be more pronounced in later versions of the sword. So I'm not sure exactly where this one falls. This one kind of falls somewhere in the middle, it seems to me. Maybe it almost looks more like something on the earlier ones. From the picture I've seen, the later ones really have like this much more. It's like a little button, really. And also, the more these got reused, so the more a blade was rehilted or something like that, the more they got ground down. So the older they are, the flatter they tend to be. Other characteristics are in the amount of detail and in the kind of detail you see on the eagle pommel, as well as on the inclination, let's say, of the beak. So the more down-facing the beak is, the more modern or the later the sword is, or at least the earlier ones tended to be more straight. So you have all of these considerable differences. When it comes to the blade, one very clear factor to kind of tell at least a 1834 from an 1847 apart is whether or not it's a hexagonal section blade or if it's a lenticular blade. Also, of course, the hexagonal ones or the 1834 tend to be shorter than the 1847. And it basically moves on without a fuller or anything, a very, very simple blade shape up to its spear tip. Now, this blade has definitely gone through some kind of polishing at some point because there are signs of old pitting or some kind of, so I'm not sure if this is like a blade that had old pitting that was removed and what you see here is the leftovers of the pitting, or if there's been some chemical cleaning perhaps, which could also be possible. But you'll see this blade has a lot of this staining on it, which doesn't bother me too much, but yeah, it's a characteristic it has. When it comes to markings, you will find in many of these, not this one, but a lot of the examples I've seen in pictures have markings, the regimental numbers, letters here. They may have them on the guard here. They may have them underneath. It's not infrequent to see. And they may also have on the brass maker's marks from the foundry where the hilt was cast. But the actual official markings that you would expect to see are usually two. And they usually come together, but it seems like that is not always the case, not on this sword at least. You will have a Potsdam mark that looks exactly like this. So it's a rectangular mark with the name of the production facility. And then you would often have on the other side, or I'm not sure if even on the same side, but definitely on the other side usually, a mark with a eagle that is an approval mark. Now, this sword does not have that. Whether it's because of the cleaning process that might have ground it away, if we look even at the Potsdam mark, you can see it's definitely not excessively deep on the blade. So it's not completely unreasonable that it may have been wiped out over time here. It might also be that the blade simply did not have that symbol, although if I understood correctly from the book, there seem to not be any examples of swords without the eagle and with the Potsdam mark, but there are examples of unmarked blades and there are examples of blades with eagle and without Potsdam symbols. So I mean, the fact that there's no example of it doesn't really say much in the sense that we have a lot of variation, I think. However, it's also possible that there may have been a mark here because you see this dark section here. Here, it feels slightly, this feels deeper than anything else on the blade here. So, although you even have these, so who knows. In any case, this one doesn't have a visible eagle. Apparently, there are often marks on the tang, And there are also marks of some blades were also made by external manufacturers. So I think, I don't remember exactly which manufacturer is mentioned, but it's one of the big Solingen makers. So obviously it seems to imply that perhaps the Potsdam facility was not always able to produce all of the required blades, so sometimes they were outsourced. And among the variations, there are also some examples with blades that are foreign, so specifically some are Austrian. So if you do see a blade that is not hexagonal, not lenticular, and does not have the Potsdam, so it's a completely off blade, yeah, sure, it might be a later substitution, but it also is very possible that it's an Austrian blade that was mounted at the time on this sword. And my feeling here is that this might be mounted incorrectly, in the sense that in most of the pictures I've seen, in all of them actually, this Potsdam mark is on the outside of the guard. So this was either it made no difference, which is possible, or it was mounted incorrectly at the time, or this has been cleaned at a later phase and then mounted incorrectly, perhaps by someone who did a restoration job, or at some point in history, maybe after its official use, but still in historical times. I don't know that. One thing I can say though is that the sharpest part of this sword, which is this section here, is on the upper side. So it is consistent with the fact that perhaps originally it would have been down on the cutting edge. In any case, most of these swords aren't razor sharp. And that is because by regulation, these were to be kept unsharpened. This is one of the many different examples of how strict and how centralized regulation was around these swords. Yeah, so for instance, the sharpening had rules around it, and also the shortening. You have many swords had been shortened at some point, but even these are normally shortened according to specific measures. So these were done kind of centrally, not shortened randomly by a troop or officer. One last feature which is interesting and I think speaks to the experimental nature a little of this sword, which is why you'll see a lot of these variants and even compositions of different swords. So these pieces were often reused. You have older pommels on newer hilts, you have different blades. So it's not necessarily it feels to me like this was kind of a model of sword that went through a lot of iterations of experimentation and a lot of reuse of parts. But one interesting feature that kind of confirms that is that at some point in the later years, so towards the end of the 18th century, some of these models had a leather ring applied to them. So not only did they have a thumb ring, but they would have had a leather ring similar to what you would see in what is it, the 1857, I think, cavalry saber, 47. Well, okay, I'm missing my date now, but another German cavalry saber, which tends to have a leather loop, or what you would also see in the IOD Degen 89, for example. So that loop that was fixed here between the hilt and the grip. So these were often then removed, so very few, if any, from what I've read, still retain that ring, but in some cases you can still see the leather, the piece of the leather ring that remains after the actual ring was cut away. So if you do have that, that also indicates not only a potential dating for the sword, but is also an interesting feature that is fairly rare, I would say. So this is the Dragoon sword model 1847. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you join in for the next one. Thank you for watching. Bye.